Let's talk a little about Economia and Akriveia. These two terms appear later in the canonical tradition. I can't exactly say when. Economia, for example, is a very old word in the Christian lexicon. I think even back to the New Testament it refers to what our Protestant brethren refer to as God's plan, or our salvation. Yes? So that's a very old word, but the distinction Akriveia, Economia is later, and it means an exact Akriveia, an application of the canons, versus it actually in economy may mean either a relaxation of certain canonical requirements or an intensification, depending on the pastoral judgment of the priest, with the bishop's permission often. Pastoral judgment regarding the salvation of a particular soul. But its application to the question you raised, that is, the recognition of, or non-recognition, of other confessing Christians' rights, is much, much later. And this question came up forcibly in a body that I've been part of for, between 30 and 40 years, since the mid-90s. The ecumenical consultation between Catholics and Orthodox in North America. It is an official body recognized by the gatherings of bishops on both sides, and with members appointed by them. And just after I joined this body in the early mid-90s, or was appointed to join it, the Catholic side said, "What's this, that we're not really Christians? That we're not really baptized? Do you think that? Then why are we bothering to talk to you if you don't think we're Christians?" And we were obliged to address this question directly. And we did, in a statement which I had a hand in writing, that is available on the web. It's called Baptism and Sacramental Economy. And this addresses directly the question, is St. Cyprian's dictum extra ecclesia, that is outside of the visible church, there is nothing. There is no Christianity. And the assumption that this statement comprises, as it were, the gold standard of Orthodox ecclesiology, that it is the default position, as it were. And our statement said, no, it is not. Now, the question of so-called sacramental economy is first evolved by a saint, Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. In response to the question raised by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1755, I think, requiring the baptism for admission to the Orthodox Church of Catholics and Armenians. Now, this was something new. The prior practice of the Church since 1484, which was the formal renunciation of the union with Rome promulgated by the Council of Ferrara-Florence in the earlier 1400s, and which Constantinople repudiated formally in 1484, and established a rite for reception of Catholics that was not baptism, but chrismation, although not the baptismal chrismation, but the single anointing on the forehead of the prospective convert. Now, St. Nicodemus justified the patriarchs, the earlier patriarchs, as it were, departure from that, by elaborating on a particular interpretation, his interpretation of Economia versus Akriveia, saying that Akriveia, the exact observance of the Orthodox faith, requires baptism from anyone outside the visible outside the visible boundaries of the Orthodox Church. But for salvation, a bishop could declare, as it were, or could confer by his simple word the baptismal grace on those prospective entrance with a TS into the Orthodox Church on the part of Catholics or other Christians. That was an economy for their salvation. And one of the keys to Nicodemus' argument was a phrase from St. Basil the Great in the late 4th century in his letter to Amphilochius, Bishop of Iconium, on the reception of those outside the visible communion of the Church. And in this letter he says he knows of Cyprian, but he will act kat economian. Now, what's he mean by that? Nicodemus ascribes to that phrase the later canonical understanding of a relaxation. But is that interpretation accurate? And many, including Father George Florovsky, John Erickson, and others, say no, what he's really talking about there is, as he states, following that phrase, the practice or the administrative use of most churches, most bishops. In other words, he's saying, no, but we do what most everybody else is doing. We'll follow that practice. Which in essence says, well, they are baptized. If they were baptized by water in the name of the Trinity, then they did get baptized. They are, he says later in the letter, they are of the church. Tis ecclesias. They're of the church. So they're in the church somehow. Even though they're not visibly members of the Orthodox Church, they're somehow, the boundaries of the church somehow include them because of their baptism, that they are baptized, that it's real. And the practice of the Byzantine Church generally was in accordance with that. For example, St. Nicodemus finds a great problem in the decree of the council, the Quinisext, the council in Trullo, at the end of the 7th century, which says, as for Severians and Nestorians, they shall be received by confession, or confession of faith. In other words, they don't have to do anything. There's no sacramental action. They just have to say, I believe as you believe. And they're received into communion. And the literature during the Christological controversies between, especially Chalcedonian Orthodox and those who refuse Chalcedon, simply presupposed you right your ship simply by entering into communion with us. But the presupposition then is that they're already of the church. They just have to acknowledge what we say. And that appears to have been the practice throughout the Byzantine era. Departures from it occurred, for example, in Russia in the 17th and 17th centuries, 16th and 17th centuries, but the Russian church was, as often as not, responding to Catholic baptism of Orthodox in the territories, especially the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was contrary to Roman practice, expressly contrary to it. Because the popes from Alexander VI, I think, had said, no, we shouldn't do that. They're already, in their language, they're already validly baptized. But they did it anyway in those peripheries of the Roman Catholic world. And so the Russians responded in kind, and they had a council in Moscow in 1677, I think it was to settle the old believer schism. What should be said? What should be the voice of the church? It was presided over by two patriarchs in the East, especially over the case of Patriarch Nicodemus in Moscow. And they said, no, you have to stop that. You follow the rite of 1484, but you can't baptize them. And it has never been since the practice of the Russian church. Now, the Greeks increasingly followed the practice of Nicodemus, using the language of Akriveia and Economia. But as Father George Florovsky remarks, that's a very late practice. It's 18th century innovation. And I remain persuaded that this is the proper approach, and have hence forbidden the rebaptism of Christians received into the church, because you can't rebaptize. It's once for all. And if they received baptism in water in the Trinitarian invocation, that form works.